Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Happy Years from 1950. And this is continuing my quest to review as much of the filmography of William Wellman as I possibly can. The Happy Years is a film I've kind of been dreading because it has gotten a pretty bad reception by almost anyone I've talked to who knows Wellman's work. And I was nervous because I don't obviously want to see a bad Wellman film. It's also incredibly unavailable, very rarely shown on TV. It's occasionally shown on TCM. And the people who have seen it, some people do actually like it and consider it kind of a lost classic. But I think the reason it kind of divides people is because it is so sentimental. And that's a side that Wellman could always play well. He certainly was sentimental. He had a lot of kids, which I always thought was evidence that he could be incredibly sentimental. But also, anytime he was sentimental in a movie, he'd always have something to counterbalance it. He'd always have a resolution that he would bring you up just so he could rip you down later. And without that, in The Happy Years, just him being sentimental, we can see, can he play that without having the takedown he usually does? I don't think he's as good at it. This is also not the greatest time in his filmography as things are winding down, and clearly he's getting sick of Hollywood. And a lot of the movies around this time were certainly showing it as well. And especially since it was during the latter days of him with MGM, which didn't exactly work out either. It's not the greatest time in his filmography, but it's also not the worst Wellman film I've ever seen either, but it's certainly not anything to write home about. John Humperdinck Stover, who is from a very prominent Stover family who keeps getting kicked out of boarding schools and reform schools because of his behavior, because he bets some kid that they can't make dynamite unless they're in a factory. He proves them wrong. He paints a horse in town green so that flies stop bothering them because the flies will just think it's grass, which is like seriously a really dumb theory. That's just stupid, kid. Like, dynamite thing was funny, but the grass thing. But apparently flies left the horse alone, so maybe his theory's not so bad, but it's kind of stupid. But anyway, so his family doesn't know what to do with him. He won't reform, he won't really grow up. So they send him to Lawrenceville Preparatory School. This is in 1896, and they send him there, and he eventually starts through going to school, through being in a house and dealing with other kids, becomes more and more grown up as he learns responsibility, as he has other kids who are more mischievous than him, as he has to deal with peer pressure, and he kind of grows up through his experiences at Lawrenceville Prep School. This was based on a lot of columns written by a writer based on his experiences at Lawrenceville Prep School, which apparently is one of the oldest schools in America. It's interesting to see a film that's nostalgic for a time that I didn't exist in, because so much of what my generation and the baby boomers before, the millennials, look at the past in these rose-tinted glasses, and whether their nostalgic view on the past lives on and still means something to future generations. And seeing a film like this made me think about that kind of a lot. And would a story about my childhood really mean anything to someone watching it 100 years later? Seeing a film from 1896 made me think about that, and there are certain parts of this that have a lot of aw-shucksiness to it that can get really annoying and can get really stupid, and the nostalgia to it definitely hurts it quite a bit. But because it has such a good performance by Dean Stockwell, because Wellman is good at male relationships, it semi-works for the kind of film it is, which is a very family-friendly kind of a movie. And I don't think he's incredibly great at it, but he seems to tread it semi-well. I think around this period he was slowly losing faith in working with MGM, and this certainly wasn't a film that helped, because he hated working with the kids, and apparently made him cross at his own kids because they were just doing immature things and everything like that. And it didn't really work out. He didn't really like working on the movie. A lot of the kid actors did, actually. Dean Stockwell himself, who most of you probably know from being the assistant guy on Quantum Leap, but was apparently a child actor, which I didn't really know before. This is one of his favorites of his from when he was a child star, because it was more comedic, I guess. I didn't think it was that funny. But its aw-shucksiness kind of shows the problem with nostalgic films, which is it's looking at rose-tinted glasses, and it's like this whole film's called The Happy Years. Like, this was the best years of his life, and it kind of doesn't really get into kind of the realism of childhood. There are some darker elements, how you can get kind of down by certain things that are happening. At a certain point, when he's afraid like all these kids are going to come up and beat him up because they forced him to play in a baseball game, which he admitted he's not good at baseball, but then they forced him to play, and then he wasn't good, which he told them before, and then they were going to beat him up for screwing it up. And then he just sits on his bed with a baseball bat and a catcher's mask. And it's like any other director would go, that's fucked up. I mean, that's scary. Like, they're going to beat him up because he screwed up this game. And that's intimidating and frightening. And they just play like, oh, shucks, these guys are going to beat him up. Oh, shucks. Tons of things like that. They just don't really get into the real emotions of the scene or think about them. There's another part where he gets all his friends when he's off for one of the summers. It's like, I guess, one semester in a whole year at Lawrenceville. And during the summer, him and his friends keep going to this girl's house and pretending they're gentlemen callers, but 12 of them come at the same time and they keep repeating the same things. And the girls in these situations, I'm like, you know, it's like kind of funny, but it honestly feels like you're kind of torturing these people just because you're so fucking hilarious. And there are just a lot of moments like that where I was like, if this could play as anything other than like, oh, back when we were kids, wow, we didn't know any better kind of crap, then it could have probably got into more of the issues with this, which Wellman was usually actually rather good at. He would ignore certain things certainly for the narrative, and I guess that made sense maybe for this, but it just doesn't come off very well. It comes off just nostalgic crap, because when you're just ignoring certain emotions to just kind of tell a story just for the cutesiness of it, that doesn't really resonate very well. It just comes off as fake, which I think a lot of this movie came off as incredibly phony, which is a sad thing for a Wellman movie. He made this right after The Next Voice You Hear, which was very much a Dory Sherry kind of a movie, and then right after he made Across the Wide Missouri, which is actually my least favorite Wellman movie. And this is not anywhere near my favorite, but I mean, I've seen like 50s family movies, I've seen like Haley Mills kind of Disney stuff, and I think in that kind of a vein of like earlier family kids films, this slightly kind of is entertaining. I don't think it's a wash or a terrible film, but it's no wonder, like, apparently there's no New York Times review of this, even though it was a major release. I'm not exactly sure what that was about. Maybe the New York Times was busy that week or something. The Happy Years, if you see it, I think it should make you think about nostalgia and how it can kind of ruin your storytelling and how it can just make it look too shucksy. He got too sentimental and he just played that one note, and it shows someone who apparently he wasn't really happy directing this film. Across the Wide Missouri really didn't work out. This adds to the continuing narrative of why Wellman left MGM to go with Rat Jack and John Wayne, or Wayne Fellows Productions, which was a much better idea for him, frankly. And this film just states that again. I think this is halfway between The Next Voice You Hear and Across the Wide Missouri. Across the Wide Missouri being the fucking worst, and Next Voice You Hear has some promise to it, has some interesting ideas. It's not a great movie either, but it's kind of like a weird curiosity. This isn't a weird curiosity, and it honestly doesn't have Wellman doing anything interesting, so maybe I'm giving this movie too much credit. There's a reason it's not available, because it's really not fun. A good Dean Stockwell performance can't really save this film. It has an early appearance by Robert Wagner, which I didn't see. Everyone says if you blink you'll miss it kind of performance, and I guess I blinked. This one's probably worse than Across the Wide Missouri, because you could blame MGM for Across the Wide Missouri for being all cut up, but this just feels like Wellman playing too much into his sentimentality, and he was someone who always understood how to control that. And maybe it was the stories that this was based on, but either way, that just feels like Wellman wasn't in the kind of environment where he could be Wellman anymore. And what he did so well with something like Battleground just a couple years before feels kind of perverted into studio family friendly nonsense with a double dose of sentimentality. And I could almost understand with one of his last MGM films, My Man and I, where it feels almost like Wellman's doing kind of one of his 30s films. They could have thought, well, Wellman's so good at doing sentimentality, maybe if he did a film like this he would do rather well with it. And certainly I can understand that it's not interesting, it's just telling your childhood itself is semi-interesting but not interesting enough. Seeing this kid grow up through his experiences and through working at school and through becoming better friends with people, that's certainly something that goes through a lot of Wellman films, and it was interesting to see him go through that. And that's an element to the film I like, and I think seeing the characters grow and seeing them become friends and seeing the other kids in the school grow is something Wellman was really good at, and this film showcases that rather well. But there are just too many little side plots going on that didn't connect. Some of them did sneak up on you and you go, oh, this is building to something, okay, I get it. And at first you're like, how is this connecting? But there's other parts, specifically like they have this big football game and you're like, okay, the movie's over, it said what it needs to say. Then he has this whole thing where he has to take a test to see if he can stay in the school. It just felt like we're just extending the movie longer than it needs to be. There's this pancake eating sequence, which is like okay, but again, like I just felt like it wasn't to the point enough with these little vignettes. It should have like made it worked on being a complete story rather than jumping all over the place to be like all these memories that happened within this time. I'm sure that all those things did in fact happen, but there has to be a cohesion to it. There has to be a reason and arcs to these things, and it felt like it just was like just trying to chronicle this. And its nostalgia and its sentimentality is what kills the happy years. I know this is always on the bottom of any list of Wellman films. I feel like in some ways it has a little more promise, but the more I think about it, the more I discuss it while I was watching it, I had a really hard time finishing this movie. He has a lot of promising films that are far more obscure in his filmography. The Happy Years isn't one of them. It's kind of to look back on the past like it was something it really wasn't, and that's the worst thing about nostalgic crap like this. It's fun to look back on it like how people of my generation look on the 90s and like, wasn't that a great time? And I always look at them like, yeah, but you were a kid, like you don't fucking know. Like the 80s were really great for me because I was like 4 and stuff. You should just look at it like that was my childhood. But when I watch films like this, I kind of think people are so into their past and so nostalgic towards it because they were full of possibilities, and at that point the world was open to them, and how amazing that felt, and they kind of want to capture that, and how it was this amazing, the happy years and such. Frankly, that's fucking bullshit, and that's kind of the thing with The Happy Years, is The Happy Years is a bullshit movie. It's a fine little family film, but it's phony and fake, and phony and fake don't go well with Wellman, and him doing this kind of thing, he's not really great at directing it. He does a serviceable studio director job and makes a fine motion picture like he can. He's a well-trained, great studio director, but I think The Happy Years isn't anything more than a nicely made, family-friendly studio film, and one through a nostalgic, sentimental gaze that chokes it from being anything close to interesting. So if you have seen The Happy Years and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And if you're a fan of William Wellman, check out my William Wellman review playlist. There'll be an annotation below. I have reviewed over 60 William Wellman films, and a vast majority of his filmography, or as much of his filmography as I can find at this point. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.